Tonight, I'll be talking a little bit just about Enspiral and our journey, hopefully about 20 minutes or so, and leaving lots of time for questions and a bit of discussion about what people are interested in. Enspiral actually, well, one of the big seeds for Enspiral was actually planted just down the road. In 2007, I walked the Camino to Santiago, and at the end of that, I was in Paris, and there was an exhibition under the Eiffel Tower by Yana Tours-Breton, who did Alive and Earth from Above. And it was a stunning photographic display of animals, people, nature, and statistics about what we're doing to the planet. And it was the first time that I really emotionally engaged with the global issues. I sort of had lots of facts about poverty and water and climate and so on, but it was the first time I really engaged with it emotionally. And that was a big factor in actually prompting me to quit my existing business and shift direction towards being an independent contractor, where I did a couple of days of work a week and the rest of my time was volunteering. So I did a lot of volunteer work on climate change and environmental issues. And after doing that for 2 years, I came up with this idea that maybe the biggest impact I could have would be helping people who want to change the world have the money and time to do so. And that was really the key idea behind Enspiral. Fundamentally, what we don't need more ideas or solutions, we just need more people who spend their lives working on stuff that matters. And so that was when I switched my personal consulting company to become a collective vehicle to help anyone who had sort of shared values or professional skills have the opportunities they needed to make whatever difference they were called to do. So I'll jump over working this slide now. So I spent about 5 years talking to lots and lots of people about what is Enspiral. And there was a big celebration in the community when these slides were put together. So basically, this is the best answer we have at the moment to what Enspiral is. The goal has always been, how can we explain this to our parents or our grandparents in a way that makes sense? And so it's, I've practiced this a bit, but I haven't spoken to these slides before, so hopefully it's sort of clear. At our heart, Enspiral is a network. So there's about 200 or so people in the network, and it looks a little bit like a professional network or a social network where it's the relationships between the people which create the value. And it's very focused on helping people who want to make a difference have the opportunity to do so. Often that manifests as entrepreneurship and creating social ventures. So instead of looking for lots of funding and grants, it's all about building businesses which can have a sustainable, ongoing social impact. And again, as a network, we're very agnostic about what impact people try to have. If you're called towards poverty or climate or food or environmental diversity and so on, that's where we go. The heart of the network is around the second idea we had after more people working on stuff that matters was that when you look at how normal companies are organised in terms of hierarchical command and control structures, that's the dominant organisational form that we see. It's also the one which evolved in an information poor environment, that when you have to exchange letters or telephone calls or even emailing people having meetings, command and control and centralising decision making, I think, is the most efficient way to do it. But when you have rich information systems, it's a suboptimal system. And all over the world, you see people naturally exploring this space of decentralised network-based organisations. And so the one thing that we've done a lot in Enspiral is start to think about what is the company or the organisation of the future going to look like. In particular, how do you decentralise money, information and control in an organisation? And so, who here has used Lumio? A couple of people? 1, 2? Cool. So Lumio is some open source software we built around the sort of the Occupy movement, and it's essentially a way to have participatory decision making in an organisation. The vision of Lumio is that every person will have a voice in every decision which affects them. And that's a really difficult information system to solve if you think about all the decisions which affect your life in your city or your government or your family or your workplace. So that's the big dream that they're trying to tackle. And it's very much at the heart of how Enspiral works. So that when there are decisions in the network, we really lean on this tool to help people know that a decision is happening, to quickly be able to pass the information and to have an input into that decision. The financial model of the network is, we've got maybe a dozen different companies. Each one of them has voluntary contributions to the foundation. And so to give you an idea, all the companies as a whole, they probably turn over about 3.5 million New Zealand dollars. That's maybe like 2.5 million euro, I think. And so that's the total amount of revenue going through the businesses. Maybe about $100,000 of that, so 60 million euro, or 60,000 euro, that goes to the centre of the foundation. And so the idea is that when a company is part of the network, it sets its own contribution rate. So it can say things like 5% of revenue, or 20% of net profit, or whatever rules they want, which is a predictable way to give money to the foundation. But when they give money in that way, they have control over how it's spent. So we use another decision-making tool called co-budget to essentially give people budget control over the money they contribute. And so this is again another, this is a bit newer for us than Linear, it's only about a year old, and it really changed the dynamic dramatically from being something where it's about giving money to someone else and having them do something to you towards owning the thing which you contribute to. So we talk about contributions rather than license fees or anything like that. Another thing is that this is completely voluntary and discretionary. So the company can change that at a month's notice. Another point on this slide is that Enspiral is very much built around fractal models. So if you look at how the whole network is organised, one of the biggest companies in the network is our professional services collective. So lots of contractors and programmers and designers who sell their time. And it works in the same model, where people contribute. The default there is 20% of revenue that you get through contract, you contribute to the centre. And that money is put in the central pool, fixed costs come out of it, and then you control how the rest is spent. So this idea of fractal models of organising in network-based organisations is a big thing we sort of explore. Cool. And you can also see that some of the companies contribute money, some contribute time, some contribute in-kind services. The whole model of Enspiral is very much around like a gift economy, altruistic network, where once people are in the network, you really trust them to make decisions in the best way they can. And so this model here is about co-budgeting, where when people do contribute money, there's a decision-making process about how that's distributed. And if I've got time, I'll dive into this a bit more. So we've got the Enspiral Foundation, which is, I guess, this key company in the network. And that's essentially a collective owned vehicle. There's maybe 35 people who have a share in the collective, one person, one share, one vote. Becoming a member is a little bit like becoming a citizen of Enspiral. And there's maybe 200 people in the whole network, so another 160 or so people who are what we call contributors. These are people who can earn their livelihoods through Enspiral and make decisions on them. There's only a small amount of decisions which are reserved for members only. And this is a very clear organisation model with a porous boundary. So it's very easy for someone to become a contributor of Enspiral. So if you meet a member and get to know them and say, hey, I'd like to join, they'll just ask you for a bio and invite you into the mix. And then it's very much up to you to navigate this complex information system to find a way to connect with people, to add value, to earn a livelihood. And after you've done that for about a year or so, normally someone passes the what they're not a member yet test. So it's like, everyone is not a member, and then someone will up and then. And that's the way that people sort of join the core of Ouishare.
Can you say that again?
Cool. So the main way that people become members is getting to know people in the community, adding value to projects, earning money through different businesses. And it usually takes about a year, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's a bit faster, before someone sort of finds their feet and is invited. And a lot of people don't become members and just stay contributors and sort of on the outskirts, and that's a feature of the design. But this idea of a company in the middle, which is a collective that acts as the sort of the node of the network, is the Enspiral Foundation. And I can run into that in a bit more detail if people are interested in the legal structure. Retreats and events and a co-working space are a big part of building the community. Like the heart of Enspiral is the people in the community and the relationships they have between each other. If we lost all our money and all our businesses and everything we built, but we still had our community, we could build it again really quickly. If we lose our community, we'll destroy anything we create. So our first and foremost goal and objective is to nurture the people in the community and their relationships with each other. And so that's done partly through in-person sort of events and facilitation, but also a lot through our online sort of community spaces, mostly Lumio and news and things like that. So the story of Enspiral is very much around, I was working by myself and just started to try and find contracts for people who had skills in the market and had shared values. We sort of emerged into this collective of contractors where there was lots of web developers and designers and a few salespeople, and then we started, accountants and lawyers started joining, and we started to diversify our professional services offerings. And then after about a year and a half, it started to switch into this network of social enterprises. So we had people naturally forming teams and starting businesses and using the surplus that they built from their contracting to fund themselves into whatever ventures they were interested in. After doing that for a few years, we started to really evolve into, I guess, building apps and tools to help people organize in a more decentralized way, which is one of our, our main strategic objectives to help. Last year, one of our main goals was to open source Enspiral so that anyone who wanted to start something similar, we'd help as much as we could within resources. So that's sort of a quick version of Enspiral. And if you go to the website, it's just whatis.enspiral.com. And so that's any sort of brief questions there before I keep going? So I think to give you a bit of a flavour of Enspiral, I'll talk about one of our most recent sort of initiatives that got launched, and a little bit about the journey so you get a bit of an idea about how things work internally. And so this is about how we started Co-Budget. So in 2013, we've been going for 3 years. We fall into this unconscious trap, and I found this quite a lot, is that a lot of us are conditioned to work in hierarchical organizations. We naturally look for the leader in the room. We naturally fall into traps of sort of old paradigms in a way. And that we found that it was really easy for us to say, okay, we've got these businesses, we're putting money in, let's hire people to be facilitators and organisers of the network. And we really just built up an under-resourced management layer. Really unconsciously, they started acting like normal managers would, and they started to become, I guess, the distance grew between the people participating in the network and the people whose job it was to facilitate the network. And so we quit. We basically shut down that management team. And so we had probably about $20,000 a month going into the core team at the time. And so instead of having most of this going to salaries and people doing the best they could to serve the network, we basically kept it as discretionary budget and invited people to pitch for projects to serve the network. So it was this was a fundamental point which shifted Enspiral's engagement and trajectory quite a lot. I basically stole it, but everything in Enspiral is pretty much copied from somewhere else. So I think it was a co-housing magazine in the States, that I read about this community who did collaborative budgeting. And essentially they'd all put money into the centre. Every 6 months they'd hold this event. They'd dress up in fancy costumes. People would make stalls and about things they wanted to do in their community, like build a retaining wall or repaint the barn or physical sort of infrastructure things. Everyone got Monopoly money and they had buckets on the tables, and people just went around putting Monopoly money in the buckets they wanted to fund. And when something hit its quota, they'd ring a bell and say, yeah, we funded the retaining wall or whatnot. And it was this event they did every 6 months, and we basically just copied it and did it monthly with spreadsheets. And it was a really simple thing, but amazingly powerful. And it really saved us when we fall into this trap of unconscious management structures into more of a crowdfunding dynamic. And so we made a spreadsheet, a simple website where people could submit bucket requests, a Google form for the details of it, like really low tech, really easy. And then we use Lumio things, so you could use an email thread for this, but we just started a discussion saying the September budgeting round is open. You can see your allocations in the spreadsheet. Before the round opened, we'd had a list of all the proposals, and then individuals would just post a comment saying, I want to fund this, this, and this with my funding. Someone would update the spreadsheet, so really manual and tedious work. And then we sort of would make reports every now and then about what we funded and how. And it was really simple, but very powerful. So the idea is, the impact this had was, on one hand, you're giving control to people about how money is spent. And that really hit our goal of decentralizing money, information, and control. So if I've given Enspiral $1,000, maybe a few $100 get taken out for fixed costs, and then the rest of it I say, actually I want to fund this or this or this or this. And so everybody started to have this experience of the same information and levers a business owner would have, and that profoundly changes people's relationships with it. Also, everyone started to have an unconscious idea about how much money we had and what we'd spent it on. And I spent 3 years sending out profit and loss reports and writing notes and spending all this time trying to communicate that with people, but it's really, it's not many people would know, oh, we have this much money and that's what we spent it on. With this process, pretty much everyone who engaged did. And so as an information tool and as a control mechanism, it was really powerful. The other big thing with this was that if you saw something that was broken, you didn't have anyone to sort of complain to, but you had a source of funding which you could apply for if you wanted to fix it. And so whether it was an opportunity or fixing something, all of a sudden there was this outlet for people's noticings and urges to improve Enspiral. And again, that had a very powerful dynamic. So those three things were really, I think, were the heart of why this succeeded for us. So as a bunch of web developers, we're naturally building an app. This is part of something we're calling the open app ecosystem, because there's a whole bunch of people out there who are trying to organize in different ways, and a lot of people building software around it. And we're really keen to sort of not reinvent the wheel all the time, and to collaborate so that people can start to tightly integrate with CoBudget or Lumio or build different versions of it. And there's a bunch of interesting applications and teams who are actually working on different pieces of this puzzle. My hope is that in the next few years we can start to get quite a rich suite of apps together, all sort of open source in the commons, and but very much intentionally designed to help facilitate the kinds of organisations we want to be part of. So you can sort of see the different buckets there are. You can see the details of it, who's contributed money, and a bunch of people using it. So that's CoBudget, and it's one of the things which we're really, the direction we're moving towards is around, I think my theory of changing the world is that the organisations that are one of the most powerful influences we have in our society, whether it's governments, whether it's schooling, whether it's education, whether it's business, or the not-for-profit world, is the organisations which really have the most impact. If we can change the way organisations function so that they externalise less cost on society, so that more of them have explicit social missions and working their energy towards achieving those social missions, I think that will make a big difference to the world. So our hope is basically to plant these cultural viruses around mission-based organisations and to package them in software. So we see CoBudget and Lumio as delivery layers for cultural viruses that will help organisations become better, both in terms of competitive advantage in their field, but also in terms of the positive impact they have on the people who work in them and their impact on society. There's 2 minutes? Cool. Alright, I'll go through these. This was the first app I built for Enspiral. It was basically an internal accounting system. So the idea was when you earned money, it would go into a company account, 20% would go to the corp, 80% would be in your personal account, and you could do anything you want with it so long as it was legal. You could pay yourself, you could hire someone else, you could buy equipment, really shifting people away from this mentality of being an employee in someone else's business towards being their own independent entity. And this internal banking system really set the tone for Enspiral. Horrible code. And we haven't sort of released this out yet, we're rebuilding it. And so you can see graphs, and you can send money, you can pay yourself or pay someone else. Lumio is probably the most mature app that we've built. There may be, I think, 25,000, 30,000 users or more of the app, and it's sort of grown pretty quick. I think the biggest user base is Podemos in Spain, and so they're using that for a lot of organising their local communities. And that's Lumio. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff which, just like with Co-Budget, where it's about find a problem, try and solve it with really low-tech information systems, find something that's powerful and sticks, and then build it and invest the time and energy to build something useful. This is me playing around with dynamic roles. So instead of having a job description, you have like a dozen hats that you wear, really small micro roles, clearly defined. But then fortnightly, the team gets together and says, actually, I'm too busy, I'm not doing this well enough, can someone pick up this micro role? So it's very fluidly evolving job descriptions in the team. We're using this in our Developer Academy school, really powerful. But there's like so much more work to do. But when you start to engage with this practice of organisation design and how we set compensation and set strategy and recruitment and all this stuff, it's just, we need all those functions, but we want them done differently. So in terms of where Enspiral's heading as a collective, this isn't the whole picture, but this is a big part of it, is basically trying to contribute to the global discussion of how can we do these things in different ways, and yeah, that's sort of where we're heading. So that's sort of the formal information I've got, so I think we jump over into questions right now.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua.
Thanks a lot, Joshua. Maybe you can tell us more about some of the Enspiral people as well, but I mean, you said there are like 200 of them and 35 core team shareholders of the foundation, but could you give like a few examples of names of people and what exactly they are doing? So we know at Ouishare, we know Ben from Lumio, we know there are a lot of other people working on all these apps, and like what are some of the key project leaders and people who are adding some essential blocks to the Enspiral community? That's a tough question because you need to choose.
Yeah, I want to mention everyone. It's is this working? Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Great. So I think that. So I guess one of the one person worth mentioning is Alana, who you may have touched base with through the Mix and Mash things. She's done a lot of work in terms of telling Enspiral's stories and participating in that community. Well, and I think one of the things which strikes me about Alana is that she travelled the world, worked in lots of different places, was on a management track in a UK-based traditional business, didn't want anything to do with the corporate world, felt like she'd never find Lattimore? Yep. Felt like she'd never find a place, a work that would sort of resonate. Joins Enspiral and is very active in the sort of leadership and on the foundation board. But one of the interesting things about her story, which a lot of people in Enspiral have done, is that people tend to hire themselves. They'll show up, they'll engage, and over time they'll find a role, and then all of a sudden they're earning money through the network and they're a deep part of the community. So this philosophy of a porous boundary and the right people hire themselves is a big one for us, and so I think Alana's one there. It was interesting when the Lumio team joined. A lot of them, I guess, came from sort of, I guess, anarchist backgrounds, and they were on the big part of like the Occupy movement. So when they were a part of Occupy, they were sitting on the council lawns having big consensus decisions with hand gestures and whatnot. A year later, they're selling citizen engagement software to the same council. And so engaging with them from people who are very anti-business and very strong, progressive sort of social values, and then having this discussion about actually how can business be a tool for those values, that was definitely an influence. I'd say there's a bunch of corporate refugees, so people from financing and banking and who sort of started off the journey of professional success. And then it sort of started out and then realised it's a shell game. The meaning isn't there, the impact isn't there, and then they look for more meaning in their work and have found it in the stuff we do. And a whole bunch of programmers. So people who sort of like to hack systems and think in a a very systems way. One of the, I'm a programmer for a long time. One of the impulses which started Enspiral for me was after I sort of had this reflection and this idea about actually the work I'm doing is not that meaningful, I did some maths and figured I'd probably have about 80,000 hours of working in my career. If I had a full career and was fortunate, that was about the sum total of my energy. And I started to think about how can I have the biggest impact with that. And that just became an optimization problem, and that was really comforting for me to engage with this really emotionally disturbing, like what we're doing to the planet and society is, I think, really, it can be really, when you engage with it emotionally, it's really big. And one thing I noticed was that engaging with it as an optimization problem was, one, an emotional coping strategy, but also a very clear strategy for maximizing impact. So there's a lot of that vein of like life hacking or system hacking as well in there.
And what do you, I would say, sell to companies? How do you convince them, and what do they expect from you?
It's pretty varied. We've got a dozen different businesses. The biggest line of business would probably be consulting software services, so people who want an app built and we build it for them. There's a lot of people who sell design work. There are people who sell event organizing and facilitation stuff. We run different conferences. Accounting services, legal services. That would be most of the revenue in the network. There's also one of the more recent businesses, Lifehack. They run social labs and accelerators. And so they've got some big contracts with New Zealand government doing those sorts of things focused on youth wellbeing. Youth wellbeing, so mental health outcomes for youth. And then we've also got a developer training school where we basically help people get the skills they need to get a job as a junior developer, so a programming boot camp. And those would be the main revenue lines in the network, which really just, they exist because those were the skills and the opportunities in front of people. I think that a different community of people would have built different revenue lines up.
And they all contract with just one entity?
As in, no. So there's a dozen different legal entities, and so they're all individual companies. Some of them are very tight mirrors of Enspiral, so they're this collectively owned venture. Others look a little bit more like social enterprise startups. Others look a little bit more like regular sort of commercial startups. And we, again, we don't really care what legal form people use, or whether they're a collective, or whether they're a couple of founders and starting something up. As a network, we have a strong preference towards collectives and I guess social enterprise. But really what we care about is more people working on stuff that matters. And so one of the big things we've had to work on is helping people focus on their financial strength, or building financial strength, because when you start to care about making an impact, it's really easy to take your eye off the ball and to not be on top of it financially. And so making it okay for people to focus on building wealth or building finances, as long as it's a means to an end, and as long as that end is social impact, that's okay. And so that's I guess, a cultural dance that we've managed a bit.
Thank you. Maybe we can take questions from the audience. Yeah.
Hello. Thanks for your explanations. What's the basic mentality of the members for you?
As in, what do we look for in members? Or?
No, I mean you create that from your experiences and your maybe your life experiences, but I guess there is a global mentality. So for you, what's the mentality of the members? What they come on Enspiral for what? About you.
So why are members part of Enspiral?
Yeah.
Different reasons for different people. Some people, it's about, a lot of it's about community, and that often when people start to do this work, it can be a pretty lonely path, especially when it's entrepreneurship. And so for people to actually have a network of peers who are working alongside it, that's really beneficial. But I think that you can get a lot of that from different networks and communities and so on.
The biggest difference I'd say there is between Enspiral and a lot of other communities out there is the level of interdependence there is between different people and companies. So for example, if I was taken outside of Enspiral and you hired me to do something, I'd be able to do some stuff. But the impact I can have embedded in Enspiral, where I can bring people into it and lean on other people and skills, it's much more. And that's true for everyone in the network. And so I think that direct benefit of, because they've got these other people they can work with, there's a lot of leverage in terms of the impact they can have. And so I think that's a big thing that people get out of it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Cool.
Hello. I was wondering, each of your dozen companies, they are trying to maximize their impact by maximizing their activity and their revenue. But for Enspiral as a whole, do you set up an objective for the network, and how do you measure a performance objective, and how do you measure that?
So we've only just started to do collective sort of goal setting. We ran our first strategy session last year, so we've been going about 4 years, and we had this collaborative process we called Mastermind, which basically kicked off with a thing like, we've given up our decentralized ways and you are now the CEO of Enspiral, tell us all what to do. And everyone going through that exercise and saying these are some things to do, and then a lot of group thinking around different proposals and different strategic options. And then we sort of voted on the ones we thought most useful, and we came up with 4 individual things for last year. We're just now wrapping up that same process for this year. Again, we've iterated it, we've improved it a little bit, but that's an annual, I guess, goal setting process. We haven't really, and again, this is one of the things which I'd love for us to do better, we haven't really tied in performance measurement to that. And so I think that there's, I feel like we've started some steps in an interesting way, but there's so much more stuff that needs to be done. So one of my main hopes in sort of engaging with the sort of wider communities out there is to find more stuff we can copy from our point of view, because I feel like everyone's got a piece of the puzzle. And if we can figure out ways where we can really quickly share them, so that Enspiral can learn from Ouishare and Ouishare can learn from Enspiral and Mutinerie and different organizations, I think we can start to build up this base of common practices held in the commons, which help all of us improve much faster than we could on our own. And so that sort of that dialogue is something that I'm really hoping we can sort of engage with.
And one of the issues of independent workers is the volatility of activities and revenues. Is there also in your community a kind of entrance that allows people to cope with bad times?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things where a collective of contractors is a very strong proposition compared to being an individual contractor. Often it's a feast or famine environment for individual workers, and for me, when I was doing contracts, I'd often get lots of requests to do work which I couldn't fulfill. And then sometimes you'd finish a contract and you'd have to spend all this time trying to find your next gig. When you've got a dozen different people who are all in that boat, it sort of averages out, so that we have, I'd say that for the size and what we've done, we have a remarkably small amount of resources spent on sales. Most of our sales is referrals, and most of it is individual referrals. So someone will work with a programmer and ask them to do a job, and they're too busy, so they'll refer it on to someone else, or a designer will know something. And so as the network of contractors grew more diverse, there was more referral activity happening. And so I think that it's not perfect, and there's always people struggling to find work, and there's always people with too much work on and whatnot. But I think that there is a powerful referral feature which happens in that model of a contractors collective. And just, I guess, one point, as I've been talking to more sort of communities out there, often the biggest barrier people feel is resourcing and finances, is that there's a whole bunch of people who would love to spend their careers working on the issues they're passionate about. But the work opportunities to do that are quite limited. There's not many people hiring programmers to solve climate change. There's not many people, hiring designers to have a really meaningful impact on global poverty. And so that when you start to help people be able to get that as their day job, it's really powerful. And so I think that when I see like the shareable community and the people I've spoken to in Ouishare, it feels like that I think this model of professional services collectives, it's really simple to copy. Like there's a lot of work there and there's a lot of things to make it happen, and there's different dynamics in the marketplaces, and individuals really matter a lot in that sort of business. But it's a pretty straightforward business, and I think it can have a powerful, it can act like a pioneer species in a community in terms of building financial strength, because all you need are people who have shared values and have skills that are valuable in the marketplace, and you can start a business which is so much easier than building a new product business or those sorts of things. So one of the hypotheses I've got is that if we're more active in sharing this model of professional services collectives, that might have a useful impact in the different communities who can sort of take the work we've done and copy it and adapt it to their context. What's that, sorry?
That doesn't company to avoid that they compete against each other. Everyone is seeing the opportunity pipeline of.
And
it's just one.
No, we don't have a central pipeline of opportunities which people compete for. It's a little bit more organic than that.
I think you might have touched on that a little bit. On your point of sort of reimbursement, how many people get paid, etc. Do you think that within this Enspiral network, people get fair market value with respect to what they might be able to get elsewhere? And the second question related to that is, do they get fair legal rights in a certain way? Because if you see what's going on in like taxis versus Uber, one of the major problems with sharing economy is the people are now getting paid the fair market and they're now getting the rights that they should be getting. In these types of networks, do you encounter that problem?
Not really. I think that we definitely haven't seen the sort of Uber dynamic, I'd say, which looks a lot like exploitation of a workforce. I would say that I've seen a lot of people who don't focus enough on their financial strength and don't earn the market rates they should be earning. Usually that comes down to sort of, I guess, because when you've got all these opportunities coming your way, and a lot of them are really exciting and a lot of them are low paid or unpaid, it's pretty hard to say, no, I'm just going to focus on the money. And so I think that, and a lot of people consciously choose this and some people unconsciously fall into it. But I think that there are a good bunch of people in Enspiral who get market rates for their work. And again, it's when we were starting out, like a grade A opportunity would be something that paid you well and had a positive impact. A grade B opportunity would just pay you well or just have a positive impact. And that there's only so many grade A sort of contracting opportunities out there. As we've become more established, we start to see more of those opportunities, but there's still more people than those opportunities. So I'd say it's a bit of a mix, but I don't think that, I think that's more a question of maturity of the community and the organisation than the fundamental model itself. And I haven't really seen the failings that I've seen in the sharing businesses.
So I have another question, which is, so you said that everybody can become a contributor, basically, and start to get involved with project, and like the step is you get to know somebody, you start to get involved, and then you find opportunities and so something. But do you have some like guidelines or rules or principles to maintain the culture, basically, to make sure that people like follow the values, the culture, that they get along with people? Do you have some sort of an approval process or something, or is it like totally organic?
Yep, no, we've got a process. Some of the work we did last year in open sourcing Enspiral was to take some of our key processes and agreements. So like, I guess if Enspiral's a mirror of a society, our legislation is our agreements. So these are formal agreements that we pass on Lumio about this is how we're going to work. So we've got agreements about diversity, and we've got agreements around company structures, and we've got agreements around members and people and how people become part of the process. So after this, I can show you that page, which has got all the processes outlined about this is what it means to be a member. And we've had lots of long discussions around what does it mean to be a member. And we've sort of got loose guidelines, but at the end of the day, a member is someone everyone else feels should be a member. And someone the community feels like, yes, I would like them to have a binding vote over the directions of this community. And so that level of trust is essentially what it means to be a member, but we do have sort of ideas and thoughts around helping people make that decision.
Can you say, in some extent, that Enspiral is a brand, in the sense that there is kind of a promise, like people would come to Enspiral because they know they'll find good professional working this way, and so they trust this brand. Is it a brand?
Yes, definitely. I think that one of the big things that we've seen in terms, like when you look at the benefits people get from collaborating, one of our key ideas is that you can achieve more together than you can alone. And some, like the referral mechanism I spoke about, that's one attribute there, but shared reputation is another one. And so especially when you have people who are skilled but might not have much of a reputation, being able to leverage the shared reputation of the network opens a lot of doors and makes a really big difference to them. And it's also something which is one of the most important things for us to protect as a community, because it doesn't take too many people doing poor work or acting in a way that we don't collectively feel proud of to damage everyone. And so I think that managing that, so yes, it's a brand, and also the more, every time, it's sort of like it's greater than the sum of its parts. And so I think one of the benefits you get from collaborating in communities is that as you build a communal reputation, it gives you more than you put into it. I think there's also a big danger to it as well. And as we start, as you sort of, there's a dynamic that people go through, and I think I'm onto my 14th or 15th company, where you sit down with people and you've got an idea and you sort of have that founding energy where it's like, okay, it's going to have this name and we're going to do this, and you go and invite people into it, and everyone who started something will sort of know what I'm talking about. And that when that happens, it can also act as an exclusionary boundary. And so that when people weren't part of starting something, they can feel less ownership over it unless you really consciously give them a pathway to have equal voice and equal power. And I think that if you take away formal hierarchies and formal power structures, what I found naturally replaces them is informal hierarchies and informal power structures. And that you need to be really careful and really conscious to put something in its place which will really actually distribute power. And so for me, starting Enspiral, one thing I found was probably in about year 2 or so. So when I started, I had the intention to give it away. I didn't want to own it. I didn't want to make money off it. I wanted to create something in the commons. And I thought maybe after 10 years, I'd trust people enough to really give it away. And it took 1 year. And then I found 12 people, and I was like, okay, you're all members. 1 share per person, here's the legal thing. It took us another 6 months to set up the legal structure. And then we had 12 people who had the same legal rights that I did. But for another couple of years, I still had the moral authority in the network. And that as a founder, that balance of protecting something and having a vision for something, but helping people grow into the ability to own it is a really tricky thing. And I think that's something that we managed to do. And I tried different ways and so on, but I consciously stepped back all the time, and it culminated in about 2013 where I went to Cambodia for sort of 3 to 4 months. And so I wasn't physically there, and it really made that was the crux where I I really stepped out of I started calling myself the ex-founder and fired myself and things. But I think that dynamic, that's really powerful, because that's when all the other people, it becomes alive. Until then, it's a dependent child.
So, if this is a brand, as you say, you don't want someone to damage your brand. It's relatively easy to hire good professional. Let's say they work 1 guy for 1 company. But sometimes you might have some more complicated project when there is some real project management skills to have. So how do you deal with this? Do you have some special agent doing this management, project management things? How do you do this? Because you can have 3 good people, but doing bad things because there is no coordination, and then it will damage your community, your brand.
I think a lot of it's about biting off things that you can chew, and so that it's easy to, it's not easy, but it's possible to win work which you can't do justice to. And so I think being realistic about what we can do as a community is really important when we pitch for work. Also, one of the, because in the beginning I was just talking to all these people saying, hey, come and do this exciting thing, it'll be so great. And so I had different sort of ideas we were exploring, but one of them was do what you love and find someone else to do the rest. And I think when you get a diverse community of skills, if you don't like accounting, you know, someone probably does, someone likes to do accounting and they're probably an accountant. And project management and design and so on, you don't have to choose between a technical track and a management track. If you want to do both, you can. If you don't want to, someone else can fill it in for you. So having a diverse skill set in the community is what makes possible doing the bigger projects, because there are people who are good project managers and like to do project management. And helping them, I find the trick is basically, if someone's a contracting programmer, I found it really easy to find them lots of work. If someone is a business development person, I found it hard to find them lots of work. So we've had real limitations of the type of skills we can engage. As we've sort of grow and scale, different niches emerge, and so it sort of opens up different opportunities. But I'd say it's an easy trap to fall into, and that the main thing is to be conscious of it.
Do you have quota? Quota? Do you do no? Okay.
Had different questions. One of it is that you talked a lot about the level of interdependence between individual members and companies that join your organization. Could you just illustrate that by giving us an example of unexpected projects that came out of this kind of interactions that wouldn't have been able outside the organization? And I had another question, which
Can I answer the first one before I forget?
Yeah. Okay.
Great. I think, so one example would be, so after Lumio sort of built organically, and they had a team of maybe about 12 people working for it at one stage, and they blinked and looked at their finances and said, actually, we can only support 4. And so it was around 6 to 7 people with fairly short notice were like, oh, we need to find work. And there was one person in particular where it was like, he had a visa that was sponsored, and it was like, if I don't find another job soon, I have to leave the country. And so one of the other teams was able to quite quickly go, okay, 6 people, let's find them work. And so within a space of 2 months or so, most of them were had different sort of opportunities in that team. And so I think that in particular when you're looking at people doing startups and entrepreneurship and high-risk things, having a strong services base to fall back on, one in terms of building up your financial strength before you take a run at the startup, but also if you need to scale back or you need to blend your income, that's really powerful. So I think that was one example where I've seen powerful interdependence in the network.
Okay, thank you. And I have 2 more questions, but if I don't want to monopolize the questions. Just was wondering, is Enspiral a non-profit? Or what is the legal structure, since it's a brand and so it's an issue? And last one is about the co-budget thing, because it was really interesting that you invented this new management tool. But could you just illustrate the problems that you had in 2013? Because you've talked about the problems that you had. And I was just wondering about what were the controversies that you had related to the budget and everything. So.
Cool. So legal structure. We primarily use limited liability companies, and we put clauses into their constitutions to make them behave like how we want them to. So the Enspiral Foundation has a charitable company constitution. So 1 share per person, shares can never be sold, they can only be given back to the company, no dividends paid to shareholders, it's a governance mechanism only, an explicit mandate that the purpose of the company is on our social mission. That's how we sort of set up the Enspiral Foundation Limited, but it's a limited liability company. We're sort of having an internal debate about whether we apply for charitable status, and the challenge there is that some activities don't fall into charitable work. In New Zealand, things like open source don't count. Things like political action definitely cross the line. And so we've decided to stay as a company to keep pure independence, but we're revisiting that decision. Most of the other companies are limited liability companies as well, with different constitutions. And I think Lumio's a formal workers' co-op. In New Zealand, there's a workers' co-op legal structure. that's the main legal things we use. That cool? Great. So co-budget, what were the actual problems we found? So one problem was no one knew, so we were doing things like we were using Lumio for budgeting decisions. So someone would say, I want to spend $3,000 on this, this, and this. And everyone would go, sounds good, but can we afford it? No one really knew how much money do we have, can we afford this new thing, can we not? So it was really hard for them to have the context of making a decision. And that could have been, we could have solved that with investing a lot in reporting. The other thing that we found was that, because I guess the first 2 years of Enspiral were pretty much a benevolent dictatorship. I basically made all the decisions and I spoke to people and tried to get as much input as I could and had this vision of participation and collaboration. But at the end of the day, I just took a lot of shortcuts and just got stuff done. And then when we built out the team and we had 4 or 5 people, we were all sort of doing that, where we'd collaborate and we'd have participation, but at the end of the day, we'd make decisions and we'd do stuff. And that there became this disconnect, in particular around incentives, and that it was for the people in the support crew, which was what we called it, that for them to secure their income, they needed the network to turn over a certain amount of revenue and contribute a certain amount in. And there was this real tension between people who, if companies contribute more, that means my job's secure, as opposed to when you have people just saying, actually, there's this shared pot of money, my livelihood's secured through something else, but if I see a project, I can pitch to this to fund something. It's a really different dynamic. And so I found that one problem we started to have was misalignment of fundamental incentives for different people in the network. And also you'd have different perspectives, and this whole thing about when a small group of people started to make all the decisions, a lot of other people felt like stuff was done to them. It wasn't their thing, they didn't participate in it. And so, and again, you can work through that stuff. It wasn't a horrible experience for us, but it was a painful one. And it prompted us to say, we're going to dissolve the support crew, and we're just going to have a pot of money, and we're just not going to do anything. And when stuff needs doing, people can, pitch for money to do it. And so that was I guess the main impetus for it.
Just one short question, which is directly related to that, because it's also struck my mind when you explain, is that. So you said you basically got rid of the support crew after that time, so that you adopted the co-budget process. But how do you then manage, I would say, like core scaffolding operational activities, which is like, for instance, accounting and financial management, communication for whole network, maybe the network weaving, community management, tech support and all that? Whether do you have is it like totally dynamic and people see the task and they do it, or do you have some people who have these responsibilities on the long term, so which is more or less equivalent to having a support crew?
The second one. So we didn't get rid of all core functions. We still kept core administration, so people who would manage memberships and people moving into the network, people who would pay the bills and manage the finances and so on, but it was a minimum. And so I think, can't remember the numbers exactly, but I think it was around maybe $12,000 a month turned into $2,000 a month sort of level. And so what we didn't resource was any form of leadership or management or even much facilitation of the network. And I guess that's a strategy that I've done a few times, which is if things don't feel right, we take stuff away and let the network feel the pain and let the network adapt around that pain and propose solutions to it, which sort of works in some contexts, but it definitely worked in this one.
What is the biggest project you've been working in terms of how many people of your network were working on it? You know what I mean? And what was it?
I think that probably in terms of a contract, the biggest commercial contract I've seen the programmers do is probably maybe $250,000 or so. And so that was maybe 4 to 6 people at different loading for 6 months or so. That's, again, those numbers could be off by a bit, but it's somewhere around there. the biggest individual contract we've done has probably been, I think it was maybe $1 million for 2 years. So that's like 600,000 euro for 2 years. And that was a team of 4 people core and a few people on the edge. Those are probably the biggest individual pieces of work we've done. And that contract was the one which the Lifehack crew were doing to facilitate multiple engagements with youth mental health and running social labs and accelerators for a couple of years.
Hi Joshua, thanks for the presentation, it was really interesting. I was wondering about scalability and issues around globalization and whether or not income tax and employment law come into play with imagining kind of people around different continents. And then also if your model is exclusively independent contractors, or could you imagine somehow interfacing with kind of what Zappos is doing with Holacracy now?
Yep, so I think that, so with Enspiral Services, which is the main contracting collective, we have 2 contracts. One is an employment contract and one is an independent contractors arrangement. The fundamentals of them are very much the same in terms of if someone's an employee, they're essentially responsible for meeting all the company's obligations to them as an employee. That means they need to maintain a company account with enough to give them redundancy if they can't afford to keep themselves. They have to be able to afford to pay their holiday leave and so on. It puts all the responsibility of employing them on themselves, which is a very non-standard way of doing it. And essentially comes with the freedom to do whatever they want, whenever they want. And that's how we've set up Enspiral Services. I'd say it's about 50-50 between employees and contractors, but they all they have an internal account, they manage it, they decide what to spend it on. We've started to have people taking on long-term employee contracts, so a few people will say, we're going to guarantee this person's income and help them get started. It's fairly mixed and diverse. A lot of companies have traditional employment contracts, so outside of the contracting collective, it's mostly employees and less contractors, though there is a fair amount of work of companies hiring contractors from the contracting pool to do individual pieces of work for them. So legally it's a bit of a mix there. All of our foreign people are independent contractors, so we only have New Zealand entities at the moment, though we will likely have a US entity kicking off soon. In terms of one thing I found is that probably from about year 2, we had people knocking on the door saying, really interesting, I want to start Enspiral in London, New York, Hong Kong, Sydney, Melbourne, and so on. Probably about 6 or 7 times I said, great, yeah, how can we help you? Can't give you any money, can't really do much at all, but good luck. And none of them worked. And so I learned a lot about, I think one was, there were a lot of things that had to go right for Enspiral to be able to launch. It definitely launched off the boom of IT contracting. So Ruby on Rails contractors in New Zealand, really easy to earn a lot of money in a short amount of time, a lot more work than there were people. There was a lot of wind in our back there. I think there was also, when people who weren't established contractors tried to set up these collectives, it was sort of like, hey, finding other people who are already contracting, come and do it through this. It really wasn't as powerful as, hey, here's a bunch of work, why don't you work with us? And so I found that so we learned a lot about how not to do it, and we sort of stopped trying to do international growth. Like the vision of a tight collective with presences all around the world was really appealing for a lot of us. One in terms of, I want to go to Canada or the US or London and not having to worry about visas or getting a job and just being able to keep working with the same network independently. The sort of digital nomad lifestyle was attractive to a lot of us, still is. And there's lots of ways to solve that problem as well, not just grow Enspiral internationally. But the main benefit we saw and still see, is that as people start to build ventures like Lumio and CoBudget and Buckybox or whatever they are, that having a tight community of people all around the world who can scale it out and directly support it as it starts to get legs and traction, that's really powerful. And particularly when we start to look at how can we help these businesses where the IP's in the commons and they're collectively owned and they've got a social mission outcompete for-profit VC-funded startups, I think is the idea of out-cooperating them, I think is sort of something we're exploring. And again, one way to solve that is to build tight Enspiral communities all sharing a brand, working together globally is not the only way to solve it. And one of the other things we hope to sort of build with reaching out to people is this alliance of people who are working in similar ways and similar styles and have this level of trust in each other's intention, so that maybe, when someone comes up with the new, alternative to Gmail or whatnot, we can quite quickly bootstrap the community with this global network of people working in that way. And so our main, I find that the network naturally grows, and we're getting people international and starting to, we will start to have a few international nodes. And I think we're not really pushing that agenda. It's like, if it happens, it happens, but what we are really pushing is, hey, if we've got something interesting, can people copy it? And can we start to build up, languages and protocols so that other communities and businesses who are aligned, that it's really easy for us to share stuff, so that when you figure something out, we can copy it easily, and when we figure out something, you can copy it easily, and we can really easily refer customers and business and all that sort of thing. I think that opportunity is really interesting and tangible, because growing a single brand or organization, it's got a speed which is sustainable. One of my favorite quotes for IT customers when they want stuff faster is it takes 9 months to make a baby. You can't get 9 women and have a baby in 1 month. And I think that one element of growing things and communities is that they're organic. And so if you think about what it really takes for people to know each other and trust each other, it's really time. And so I think when we're building high trust communities, time is a really important factor in it. And so there's this natural speed, I think, and there's this natural limit to growth as well. A company might be 10,000 people or something, but how do you get to 10 million? And you only get to 10 million by lots of replication and copying. And so I think that's what we're really interested in.
Thank you, Joshua. On a une toute dernière question et après je propose d'aller prendre un verre. Voilà, peut-être deux. Alors,
Good evening. Sorry if you said it already in your presentation because I arrived a bit late. Could you explain how do you finance the cost structure, and what's the financial relationship between the cost structure and the businesses you incubate?
Cool. I guess one point is that we're not an incubator or accelerator in a traditional way. It's much more of a community of peers doing things. We've bootstrapped everything. We haven't had internal investment into the core. We haven't really directly invested into businesses ourselves. A couple of them have raised investment rounds. I think the total would be maybe $300,000 or $400,000. And I think that that's been some investment going into the individual ventures. But the main way the financial flow works is, at a network level, individual companies make a commitment for a financial contribution. Some of them don't make any financial contribution. They might make an in-kind contribution. It's really about what maturity that business is at. And that flows into the foundation. I think the total revenue of the network is around 3.5 million New Zealand, and around $100,000 flows back into the core funding of the network, maybe 120. So you sort of get an idea about how much of the total revenue finds its way into the centre. And the big thing about that is it's discretionary and it's changeable, so that a company can, with the month's notice, change the rules of its financial contribution. And this was a really powerful lesson for us, because when we first started, we had exactly the same model, but it was with individual contractors. So if you were doing work on an Enspiral contract, 20% would go to the collective, 80% would go to you. And that made sense for a lot of people and a lot of contracts, but it also didn't make sense for a bunch of people and a bunch of contracts. So if I've got an existing client and I really want to work with Enspiral, bringing it into the collective and giving up 20% of the revenue feels like a really big hit. And some people would do it if they were really motivated, but a lot of people wouldn't. So what we did was we basically said individual contractors can choose their contribution rate. The default is 20%, but if people want to change it, all they have to do is let everyone know. And they can do it at their discretion. They don't need to ask permission, it's just notifying. And that dynamic of saying, here's a default, this is what the cultural norm of contributing to the collective is, but if you want to change it, do so, and giving people that trust, that was really powerful. And I think there's probably 4 or 5 things like that, like co-budget, Lumio decision-making, discretionary and voluntary contributions, which really shaped Enspiral in a big way. So that's the heart of our financial model.
Thank you very much.
sorry. I love the idea of at least scaling down on the management team. The thing is, sometimes you could see a problem and ask for a way to fix it, but not have the skills to do it yourself. Have you been in that situation? Do you outsource some of that? How do you do that?
I'd say we haven't solved that properly at the moment. And again, some of the things that I'd really love to see in Enspiral are a task market, where you can start to have less of a project breakdown, but more like individual task breakdowns, and better quality assurance on some of that stuff. Because it is really easy for someone to say, hey, here's a problem, and I'm going to try and solve it, but maybe they're not right for it. We solve that culturally at the moment. So if someone tries to take on something, you might have a word with them, or someone might have a conversation with them. Or if it doesn't work, someone might jump in and pair with them and try and get it done to that level. But again, it's an okay solution, but it's not a great one.
Do you have any training pertaining to this? Do you try to build up your skills on things you think you're lacking?
Yes, in an informal way. There's a lot of, I guess, people who can say, hey, I'll do a workshop on this, a skill sharing on this. One of our startups is called Trickle, and so it's essentially a community learning platform where if you take everyone in the room and you say, what do you most want to learn and what do you feel most comfortable teaching, and you add that up across communities, and then you say, hey, you want to learn design and some people know Photoshop, let's get a small class together of 6 people and do some education stuff. That's the heart of that business. And so we've done that internally a little bit, but I'd say that we've only scratched the surface of the potential there. I mean, my feeling is Enspiral's like 5% of where we need it to be. There's some good stuff, it's sustainable, it's not going to go broke anytime soon, it's contributing something useful to the world, it's creating livelihood for a bunch of people, but it's just starting out. And I think that when you look at, there's a great book that came out recently of reinventing organizations, and the analogy of like when you look at a penguin walking on land and it sort of waddles and it's not that useful or good and so on, but when you watch it swim and that difference, I think that really sums up for me how I feel about the way our organizations work, is that what we actually do at the moment when we collaborate together, we're penguins waddling on the land, and that when we get our act together and when we get these systems built and these cultures and processes established, we'll be swimming in the sea. And I think we will see 10x 15x, 20x, maybe even 100x performance increases in our teams and companies when we really nail this stuff. And so I think that's the potential. So I feel like we're going in the right direction, but we're really just at the beginning.
Thank you, Joshua. That would be so much. This chat, and let's have a drink together.